Welcome to reformed thinking. Usually when we sign an employment contract, there is an expectation of strict mathematical precision.
Right, a guarantee of fairness.
Yeah. You agree to give 40 hours of your week, and the company agrees to deposit a specific predetermined amount of currency into your bank account. It is a binary arrangement. You put in the labor, and the reward is guaranteed by the legal phrasing on that piece of paper.
That is the ideal scenario, I mean. It is clean, it is categorized. We naturally crave agreements that are visible, predictable, and fair because they give us a sense of control over our own lives and our own provision.
We really like to believe that if we just follow the rules, the system will treat us fairly. But then you step into the world of human greed, corporate pragmatism, and total depravity, and suddenly that pristine contract is torn to shreds.
Absolutely. We are looking at a professional landscape today that is incredibly murky. You might find yourself feeling squeezed by a manipulative employer, trapped in an unfair system where the rules change the very moment you start succeeding.
The goalposts just keep moving. The commission structure gets altered right before a big sale, or the promotion is dangled endlessly without ever materializing.
It is the absolute definition of a rigged system. And it is a reality that causes an immense amount of anxiety and frustration for anyone trying to earn an honest living.
And that is the specific situation we're going to analyze in today's deep dive into the source material. We welcome you, the listener, to this conversation. Today, we are analyzing the theological drama of Genesis chapter 30, verses 25 through 36.
Yes, and we are framing this entire discussion around a situation you might know all too well. The friction of working under someone who views you as a commodity to be exploited rather than a human being to be respected.
We're going to contrast the cold calculus of worldly pragmatism with the quiet overriding and absolute providence of God.
But we must state clearly from the outset that this text is not a simple HR dispute regarding ancient livestock, nor is it a validation of modern prosperity gospel doctrines.
Right, those doctrines which suggest that if you follow certain steps or speak certain words, God guarantees your financial success and material comfort.
Spot on. Instead, this passage stands as a striking illustration of God preserving his covenant people in a fallen, hostile world. It is about how the creator of the universe maneuvers through the treachery of wicked men to secure the promises he made to his chosen people.
I want to jump right into the narrative because the tension here is palpable. Let's look at the turning point in the story, the call to the covenant land found in Genesis 30, verses 25 and 26.
Yes, let's set the stage.
To establish the context for you, Jacob has just finished 14 years of strenuous, back-breaking labor for his wives, Leah and Rachel. He has been operating entirely under Laban's heavy-handed, tyrannical authority in the region of Padan Aram.
And we are not talking about an air-conditioned desk job here. This is ancient shepherding. It means exposure to freezing temperatures at night, scorching heat during the day, and constant vigilance against predators.
After 168 months of this subjugation, the birth of his son Joseph acts as the specific catalyst for Jacob requesting to return to his own home and country. I was looking at the notes you provided on the Hebrew syntax regarding the completion of the covenant, the Berit.
Yes, the Berit. Jacob is not walking into Laban's tent asking for a vacation or a favor. He is demanding the legal release he has rightfully earned.
The text is very clear on that.
When we analyze the original language, the phrasing Jacob uses is not the posture of a beggar hoping for a scrap of mercy from his master. The syntax highlights the legal fulfillment of a binding agreement. He says to Laban, "Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me go."
He has discharged his debt in full.
He has. For 14 years, he has lived in what we might accurately call the earthly prison of Laban's household. He arrived there as a fugitive, fleeing the wrath of his brother Esau, desperately seeking safety.
But he quickly became an indentured servant to a man who possessed no moral compass whatsoever.
Right. However, Jacob's demand to leave is not motivated by simple exhaustion. It represents a massive theological shift. He is transitioning from that earthly prison toward a covenantal pilgrimage.
He is turning his face back toward the promised land of Canaan, the specific geographic location tied to the promises God made to his grandfather Abraham and his father Isaac.
Let's put this into a modern corporate context to really grasp the weight of what Jacob is doing. Jacob is like a modern employee who has just satisfied a grueling 14-year non-compete clause.
Wow, yeah, a 14-year non-compete.
For over a decade, this person has poured every ounce of their intellectual property, their sweat equity, and their waking hours into building up a firm that belongs entirely to someone else. They have generated record profits, expanded the client base, and built an empire for a ruthless CEO who takes all the credit.
And finally, the clock runs out on that restrictive contract. The employee walks into the corner office, looks the CEO in the eye, and says, "I am fully vested. My legal obligation is complete."
I am demanding my release, and I am taking the shares I lawfully earned to start my own firm. That is the energy Jacob is bringing into this moment.
But as I read through this, a massive question jumped out at me regarding the timing. Why wait for Joseph's birth specifically? Rachel had been barren for years, while Leah and the handmaids were having children left and right.
That is a very sharp observation.
What does this timing signal about Jacob's understanding of God's timeline versus his own desires? I mean, why didn't he ask to leave after the birth of Reuben or Simeon or Judah?
Answering that requires us to apply a redemptive historical lens to the text. Joseph's birth is the indicator that a specific phase of God's plan has reached maturity. Up until this moment, the narrative focus has been entirely on domestic multiplication.
God was building the house of Israel.
Literally constructing the 12 tribes through these complicated, messy, and often highly painful family dynamics. Jacob had to wait for Rachel, his chosen bride, to bear a son.
Because Rachel's womb was opened according to God's sovereign timing, not human effort or biological manipulation.
Absolutely. Once Joseph is born, the household has reached a new stage of establishment. The focus shifts from multiplying the family to directing that family toward the covenant promises.
Jacob realizes that his family cannot remain swallowed up in Mesopotamian dependency.
If they stay in Laban's house forever, they assimilate into pagan culture. Their distinct identity as the people of Yahweh evaporates, and the distinct line of the promised seed is lost to history.
So, the birth of Joseph is essentially the alarm clock going off. It signals that the season of building a family in exile is over, and the season of moving toward the inheritance must begin.
That is a great way to put it. And this brings us to a significant theological distinction that we must make. We have to contrast the Reformed view of the land promise with dispensationalist views.
This is a vital point to clarify for the listener.
Dispensationalism often reads the Old Testament promises of land with a strict literalism that separates Israel and the church into two distinct peoples with two distinct programs. They view the physical land of Canaan as an eternal physical real estate guarantee for ethnic Israel alone.
However, operating from a Reformed theological framework, adhering to the Westminster Confession, we understand the covenant of grace as a unified whole spanning both testaments.
Yes. The physical land of Canaan was a type, a shadow, pointing to the greater reality of the kingdom of God and the new heavens and new earth.
When Jacob longs for Canaan, he is certainly longing for the physical dirt promised to his fathers. But the writer of Hebrews tells us that the patriarchs were looking forward to a city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God.
Jacob is recognizing that the believer, while residing in the pagan territory of Laban, belongs entirely to the kingdom of God. He is rejecting citizenship in the city of man.
Which means Jacob's request is not just a career change. It is an act of spiritual defiance. And because Jacob makes his lawful request based on his completed labor and his covenant identity, Laban's true motives are forced out of the shadows and into the blinding light.
This sets up a massive clash of worldviews.
If Jacob's worldview is built on God's promises, Laban's worldview is built on sheer, unadulterated pragmatism. We see this play out in Genesis 30, verses 27 through 30. Laban hears Jacob's demand to leave, and he immediately panics.
He is terrified of losing his cash cow.
He begs Jacob to stay, citing that he has learned the Lord blessed him because of Jacob. Laban essentially throws a blank check on the table and asks Jacob to name his wages.
Laban's response is one of the most revealing psychological and spiritual portraits in all of Scripture. We need to unpack the Hebrew word used here when Laban says he has learned by experience or learned by divination.
The word is nosh.
Yes, nasha. This is not a man looking at a spreadsheet and running a standard cost-benefit analysis. The root of nasha implies the use of occultic observation, seeking omens or reading signs. Laban is relying on ancient pagan mysticism.
In the ancient Near East, men like Laban would examine the entrails of slaughtered animals, or observe the patterns of the stars, or read the omens in the natural world to determine the will of the gods.
And through these pagan practices, the mystical signs have pointed him to an undeniable fact. Yahweh, the God of Jacob, is the source of the exploding wealth of his estate.
But the crazy thing is, he realizes the God of the universe is operating in his backyard, and he doesn't fall on his knees in worship. He doesn't repent of his idolatry. He just tries to figure out how to monetize the situation.
Precisely. He treats Yahweh purely as a utilitarian asset. He views the creator of the universe as a localized deity that can be harnessed and manipulated for agricultural profit.
This introduces the fascinating concept of borrowed blessing. Laban is enjoying the temporal overflow of God's favor without ever submitting to the God who dispenses that favor.
God promised to bless Abraham and his offspring, and Laban happens to be standing close enough to the splash zone to get wet.
I love that visual, the splatter.
The livestock multiply, the wealth increases, and Laban reaps the massive financial benefits of proximity to the covenant servant. But we must be absolutely clear. Borrowed blessing does not equate to saving grace.
A person can experience the common grace of God's provision while remaining entirely hostile to God's authority.
They certainly can.
I have to jump in with an analogy here because this dynamic is incredibly common in the modern workplace. Laban is like a ruthless CEO who keeps a Christian employee around as a lucky rabbit's foot.
Oh, that happens all the time.
The CEO notices that the department run by the Christian manager has the lowest turnover, the highest productivity, and the best client retention. The atmosphere is peaceful, the work gets done ethically, and the profits soar whenever that specific employee is on shift.
The CEO does not care about the manager's faith, morals, or God. The CEO only cares about the positive variance on the quarterly earnings report.
So the CEO will throw bonuses at that manager, offer promotions, and do absolutely anything to keep them from transferring to a competitor. And they do this not out of love or respect for the employee's character, but out of pure greed.
It is entirely self-serving.
But I want to push back on your theological assessment of Laban for a second. If Laban explicitly recognizes the name of Yahweh, and he vocally acknowledges that the blessing comes from Yahweh, how does that not qualify as at least a basic, genuine faith?
That is a fair question to ask.
He is confessing God's provision out loud. Isn't that what we want people to do?
What you are identifying is a theological mirage. It looks like water from a distance, but when you get close, it is just hot sand. To see through this mirage, we must lean heavily on the doctrine of total depravity.
Okay, let's break down total depravity for the listener.
Total depravity, as understood in Reformed theology, does not mean every human is as thoroughly evil as they could possibly be in their outward actions. It means that every faculty of the human soul, the mind, the will, the emotions, is tainted and corrupted by sin.
So Laban has cognitive awareness of Yahweh. He possesses a factual, intellectual knowledge that Jacob's God is producing sheep and wealth.
Yes, but his will remains violently opposed to the holiness and authority of that God. Laban wants the gifts, but he fiercely rejects the giver. He wants the gold, but he wants absolutely nothing to do with the glory of God.
Genuine faith, saving faith, always involves a surrender of the heart, a sorrow for sin, and a loving submission to the lordship of God. Laban exhibits none of these traits.
He exhibits zero submission. He is attempting to bribe the Almighty to keep the cash flowing.
He wants the benefits of the kingdom without bowing to the king. He views God as a cosmic vending machine. You put the right coins in this case, keeping Jacob around, and the blessing pops out the bottom.
That is a perfect description. And we must contrast this sharply with the seeker-sensitive movements and prosperity theology that plague the contemporary church landscape today.
Prosperity theology operates on the exact same pagan frequency as Laban. It treats God as a means to corporate growth, physical healing, or financial success.
It reduces the sovereign Lord to a tool for human advancement. When pastors market Jesus as the secret to your best life now, or the key to unlocking your financial potential, they are teaching their congregations to practice nausea.
They are teaching them to divine blessings for selfish gain.
Furthermore, from a reformed cessationist viewpoint, we maintain that true knowledge of God comes solely through his closed canon of Scripture. God has spoken definitively in the 66 books of the Bible.
He does not reveal his saving truth through Laban-style mystical vibrations, subjective omens, or reading the tea leaves of your financial portfolio.
Laban's supposed faith is purely pragmatic, and because his heart is ruled by total depravity, he cannot deal honestly. This calculated greed naturally leads him to attempt to rig the system the moment Jacob proposes a new deal.
Which brings us to the negotiation table in Genesis 30, verses 31 through 36. Because Laban's pragmatic greed is running the show, he tells Jacob to name his price. He thinks he has the upper hand.
He assumes he is in total control.
And Jacob's proposal is absolutely baffling at first glance. We need to break down the specific terms of this new wage agreement because it sounds like Jacob is making the worst business deal in human history.
It really does sound crazy.
Jacob asks only for the genetic anomalies of the flock, the speckled, the spotted, and the black animals. To anyone unfamiliar with ancient shepherding, that might sound like a random choice.
But Laban immediately agrees to this. And then, before Jacob can even react, Laban secretly removes all the matching animals that very day and places a massive 3-day distance between them and Jacob. What is going on with the genetics here?
We need to look closely at the biological and mathematical improbability of Jacob's request to understand why Laban jumped at the offer.
In normal ancient Near Eastern animal husbandry, the vast majority of sheep are solid white, and the vast majority of goats are solid black or dark brown. Speckled, spotted, or distinctly marked animals are rare genetic recessives.
By asking for only the anomalies as his wages, Jacob is proposing a wage structure that virtually guarantees his absolute poverty under normal natural conditions.
He is asking for a tiny, statistically insignificant fraction of the offspring. If you run a massive flock of sheep, you might only get a handful of spotted lambs in an entire breeding season.
So from a human perspective, it is financial suicide. Jacob is agreeing to work for pennies on the dollar.
Yes, this is why Laban agrees so enthusiastically. Laban runs the numbers in his head instantly. He thinks he has just secured Jacob's expert labor for free.
But the truly wicked nature of Laban's heart is exposed in what he does next.
We must examine the discourse feature of Laban's immediate malicious sabotage. He agrees to the terms verbally, smiling and shaking Jacob's hand, but his actions reveal his utterly corrupt nature.
He does not even wait for the sun to go down. He immediately culls the flock, removing every single animal that possesses the genetic markers Jacob requested.
He strips out all the speckled and spotted males and females. He gives those animals to his own sons and moves them a 3-day journey away. Laban is actively attempting to control the genetic outcome.
By removing the speckled and spotted breeding stock, he is ensuring that the recessive traits have almost zero chance of appearing in the new lambs.
2 solid white sheep might occasionally produce a spotted lamb if they both carry the recessive gene, but by removing any visible proof of the gene, Laban is stacking the mathematical odds astronomically against his son-in-law.
Laban is deliberately cornering Jacob into permanent, inescapable servitude.
Okay, let's use another modern analogy to make this crystal clear for anyone who has ever worked in sales.
This scenario is like an employer offering a sales worker a 100% commission rate on a very specific, highly niche software product.
The employee agrees, thinking they can hustle, make some calls, and carve out a decent living.
But then overnight, the employer secretly logs into the company database and deletes all the client leads, shreds all the marketing materials, and removes all the contact info for that specific software product.
They stack the deck so heavily that the employee cannot possibly make a single sale. This guarantees the employee remains trapped, answering the phones for the other products just to survive on a meager base salary.
But this raises a massive question for me. Look at Jacob here. We know Jacob is a smart guy. Is Jacob simply being naive in making this offer?
Not at all.
Does he not realize Laban is going to cheat him? Or is Jacob intentionally trapping Laban by relying completely on a miracle?
Jacob is absolutely not being naive. He has lived with Laban for 14 years. He knows the reality of how deceitful and calculating his father-in-law is.
He has seen the man's character up close.
Jacob deliberately constructs an arrangement where human manipulation cannot take the credit for his success. He balances success entirely within the realm of the miraculous.
He is forcing a situation where, if he prospers, it will be undeniable proof that Yahweh, not Laban, and not even Jacob's own shepherding skills, caused the increase.
This exposes a core malignant aspect of sin in Laban's heart: covetousness. Laban's actions reveal an absolute unwillingness to see another person prosper lawfully.
Even when the contract is heavily weighted in his own favor, Laban cannot tolerate the thought of Jacob gaining even a single spotted lamb.
This teaches us a severe lesson about the world we live in. Human contracts, legal agreements, and corporate policies offer zero protection when the human heart is governed by greed. You cannot out-negotiate total depravity.
The paperwork means nothing if the person signing it is morally bankrupt. They will always find a loophole, or they will simply break the rules and dare you to sue them.
Since human contracts fail, and Laban has maliciously stacked the deck against him, Jacob has no earthly recourse left. He is mathematically and biologically trapped in a foreign land.
And this brings us to the theological core of the text. When human leverage evaporates, we see how God operates above rigged systems through his absolute, improbable providence.
And to understand this, we need to apply the theology of the Westminster Confession. This is where the narrative shifts from human desperation to divine sovereignty.
We must introduce Chapter 5 of the Westminster Confession of Faith, which deals explicitly with the doctrine of providence.
The confession states that God, the great creator of all things, doth uphold, direct, dispose, and govern all creatures, actions, and things, from the greatest even to the least.
This government is exercised by his most wise and holy providence, according to his infallible foreknowledge and the free and immutable counsel of his own will.
That is a dense, beautiful piece of theology, but I want to break down those specific verbs. Uphold, direct, dispose, and govern. This is not a passive God who just wound up the clock of the universe and walked away.
Far from it. Those verbs indicate meticulous, exhaustive control. It means that absolutely nothing happens outside of God's sovereign decree.
Not the roll of the dice, not the fall of a sparrow, and certainly not the genetic combinations of sheep in a Mesopotamian pasture.
We must contrast Reformed theology with Arminianism in this context to see the beauty of what is happening. Arminianism suggests that God reacts to human choices, that he permits things but does not decree them in a sovereign, absolute sense.
If we apply an Arminian lens to this text, God is simply hoping Jacob can figure out a way to breed the sheep. Or perhaps God steps in only as a backup plan when Laban cheats.
The Arminian God is like a chess player, constantly adjusting his strategy based on the moves Laban makes.
But Reformed theology insists that Jacob's success does not depend on his own cleverness, his positive confessions, or his human effort. God designed the chessboard, he carved the pieces, and he decreed the final outcome before the foundation of the world.
Laban's attempt to manipulate the system, to separate the flocks by 3 days, is framed as the futile, pathetic raging of a pagan against the absolute decree of the Almighty.
God had already ordained that the wealth of Laban would be transferred to Jacob. Laban's trickery is just the scaffolding God uses to display his own glory.
But I have to push back on the practical side of this theology, and I know many people listening will have this exact thought.
Let's hear it.
If God's decree is absolute, and he has already planned to bless Jacob regardless of Laban's tricks, why should Jacob bother negotiating at all?
That is a very common question.
Why shouldn't Jacob just sit under a tree and wait for the spotted sheep to drop from the sky? For the person listening to this right now, why should you bother working hard, showing up on time, or striving for excellence in your career if God's providence is already locked in?
Doesn't this absolute sovereignty make our daily labor pointless? If God is going to bless me, he will bless me, so I might as well just relax.
Right.
That is the classic objection to Reformed theology, and it represents a theological error known as antinomianism or fatalism, which the scriptures fiercely reject. The confession provides the answer. God's providence operates through ordinary means.
God decrees the end, but he also decrees the means to achieve that end.
Jacob's diligence in the fields, his daily shepherding, his active engagement in the labor ran, these are the ordained instruments through which God delivers the blessing.
God is the ultimate source of the wealth, but Jacob's calloused hands are the means. The text absolutely refutes passivity. God's sovereignty requires our faithful stewardship.
We do not work hard to force God to bless us or to earn his favor. We work hard because God has ordained our faithful labor as the theater in which his providence is displayed.
If you stop working, you are stepping outside the ordained means of blessing.
God's absolute control should fuel your diligence, not extinguish it, because you know your labor in the Lord is never in vain.
So, the sovereignty of God is the safety net that allows us to work with immense courage. We can work hard, knowing the final outcome is secure, even when the boss changes the commission structure 10 times in a single year.
Yes, and seeing God's sovereign protection of a flawed patriarch like Jacob naturally points us to look at the bigger picture. We have to look at the ultimate fulfillment of this covenantal preservation in the New Testament.
We cannot just read this as a business seminar on how to deal with a bad boss.
We absolutely cannot read the Old Testament as a collection of moral fables. We must employ a redemptive historical reading of the text.
The Bible tells one cohesive story of redemption. In this story, Jacob is a shadow, a type. Jesus Christ is the substance, the reality.
There is a clear connection between Jacob's labor and Christ's labor. Jacob left his home, traveled to a foreign land, and subjected himself to grueling, humiliating labor under a wicked master to secure a bride.
Jesus Christ left the glory of heaven, descended into the foreign land of this fallen world, and subjected himself to the grueling, wrath-absorbing labor of the cross to secure his bride, the church.
But we have to acknowledge the massive elephant in the room here. Jacob is far from perfect.
In fact, he has a very shady, manipulative past. He literally deceived his blind father, Isaac, putting goat skins on his arms to steal a blessing. He negotiated ruthlessly with his starving brother Esau over a bowl of stew.
He was a schemer.
How do we responsibly view a known, documented deceiver as a picture of the sinless Son of God? Isn't that a dangerous parallel to draw?
That is a necessary caution, and it requires us to clarify the mechanics of biblical typology. Typology does not mean the shadow is morally equivalent to the substance.
In fact, the imperfections of the type are meant to heighten our longing for the perfection of the antitype. We contrast Jacob's imperfect, flawed character with Christ's sinless perfection.
The very fact that the covenant line moves through severely flawed men like Jacob proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that salvation relies entirely on God's grace, not human merit.
If God only used perfect people to accomplish his will, there would be no patriarchs, no prophets, and no apostles.
Christ is the true and better Jacob. Jacob was exploited by Laban, but he also had his own history of exploitation. Christ, however, was entirely innocent, yet he willingly allowed himself to be exploited by wicked men to accomplish the decree of the Father.
And let's look at the sheep themselves. This blew my mind when I realized it. Jacob negotiated for the spotted, the speckled, the black animals.
He specifically asked for the genetic outcasts, the animals that the ancient world considered flawed or undesirable.
And there's the beautiful gospel connection. Christ descended into the earthly prison of this world to secure a flock.
But he did not come for the spiritually elite, the self-righteous, the solid white sheep who think they have no need of a physician.
Christ came to secure spotted and blemished souls, people stained and marred by the reality of total depravity. He took the outcasts, the despised, the genetic anomalies of the spiritual world, and claimed them as his own.
Furthermore, we must reference chapter 11 of the Westminster Confession, which covers justification. Christ took the marks of our iniquity upon himself on the cross.
Justification is based solely on the imputed righteousness of Christ, not on anything wrought in us or done by us. Our spiritual bank accounts are completely bankrupt. We have no leverage to negotiate with God.
But Christ, the true and better shepherd, earns the wages of righteousness through his perfect obedience, and he freely imputes or credits those wages to our accounts.
Because our eternal inheritance is completely secure in the finished work of that true and better shepherd, our daily response to earthly injustice has to drastically change.
We cannot live like people who have no hope, or people whose entire identity is tied to their retirement fund.
We need to bring this massive theological synthesis directly to your daily life. Let's break the application down into 3 categories: the head, the heart, and the hands. Let's start with the head. What does the intellect need to grasp here?
For the head, the intellect, you must settle the doctrine of God's absolute decree. You need to cement this in your mind so firmly that when the storms of workplace injustice hit, your theology holds you steady.
Reject the mystical pragmatism of the modern age. Stop looking for signs, omens, or secret formulas for success.
Ground your mind in the revealed Word of God and trust that His providence governs every spreadsheet, every boardroom decision, and every rigged contract. The head must know, without a shadow of a doubt, that God is on the throne and Laban is not.
And then we move to the heart. Once the head knows the theology, what does this mean for our affections, our desires, and our fears?
The heart must fiercely confront the idol of security and the fear of man. We all want to feel safe, and we naturally look to our employers, our bank accounts, or our contracts to provide that safety.
You must stop seeking validation, fairness, or ultimate security from the Labans of the world. Laban will always let you down. Laban will always prioritize his profit over your well-being.
If your heart is tethered to the expectation of worldly fairness, you will live in a constant state of anxiety, anger, and bitterness. You must tether your heart to the covenant maker. Your worth is determined by Christ's labor, not your employer's appraisal.
Which brings us to the hands, the actual physical living out of this theology in the cubicle, on the job site, or in the boardroom. We apply what Reformed theology calls the third use of the law.
Correct. The first use of the law exposes our sin, the second restrains evil in society, but the third use of the law acts as a guide for Christian living. It teaches us what pleases God.
For our hands, this means we must labor with integrity. We do our jobs with excellence, honesty, and diligence, not as a way to earn salvation, but as a form of grateful obedience to the God who has already saved us.
I want to directly address a massive issue in the modern workplace with this specific point.
Let's say you know your boss is actively cheating you. They took away the spotted sheep, so to speak. The modern cultural trend to deal with this is a concept called quiet quitting.
Right, doing the bare minimum.
You do the absolute bare minimum required to not get fired, out of spite for the exploitation. You clock in, you stare at the screen, you do terrible work slowly, you clock out, and you refuse to give an ounce of extra effort. It feels like justified revenge.
How does the text of Genesis 30 challenge that coping mechanism?
It challenges it by warning us against adopting Laban's deceptive tactics. If you engage in quiet quitting, you are allowing Laban's sin to dictate your morality.
You are fighting manipulation with passive manipulation. You are compromising your own character because someone else lacks character.
The believer must work diligently, not to please an exploitative earthly master, but to honor the covenant maker. The Apostle Paul tells us in Colossians, "Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men."
Your integrity is an act of worship. When you work hard for a boss who cheats you, you are demonstrating that your final reward is not tied to their payroll.
Furthermore, participating in the means of grace, particularly the Lord's Supper, reinforces this trust. When we come to the communion table, we consume the visible word.
We are nourished by the signs of Christ's broken body and shed blood, which proves to us tangibly that worldly sin, injustice, and death cannot stop God's grace.
The Lord's Supper fuels our hands to work with integrity in a broken world because it points us to the finished work of Christ.
As we bring our deep dive into the source material to a close, let's summarize what we have covered. Genesis chapter 30, verses 25 through 36, exposes the absolute folly of worldly pragmatism.
Laban tried to rig the system. He tried to control the genetics, move the flocks, and permanently corner the covenant servant. But his schemes were crushed by the weight of divine sovereignty.
The text highlights the absolute certainty of God's providence over rigged systems. God will preserve his people. He will secure his spotted and blemished flock, no matter how much the world tries to steal them away.
The schemes of men are temporary, fragile, and doomed to fail. But the decrees of God are internal, absolute, and guaranteed to succeed.
I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought.
Look closely at your own life, particularly your ambitions, your professional drive, and your daily anxieties. Ask yourself, are there areas where you treat God the exact same way Laban did?
Are you asking for his benefits, his wealth, his physical protection, while quietly rejecting his rule over your morality and your decisions?
We started this conversation talking about the expectation of precision in employment contracts, the desire for a mathematically fair arrangement.
Consider whether your daily peace relies on the fairness of those human contracts, which can be torn up at any moment by a greedy boss.
Or does your peace rely on the finished, unalterable work of the covenant maker, who has already secured your final reward in the true and better shepherd?